Hello, everybody. We are so happy to start this second session of phenomenological transfer. This second session is entitled Philosophy of Mind and Cognitive Science. We are going to start for the presentation of our junior researchers. The first is Rafael Aybar, who is also the organizer of this axis of this conference series. Rafael Aybar is a fellow of the Vienna Doctoral School of Philosophy and collaborates with the URC project Possible Life, the Philosophical Significance of Extending Biology. He's a philosopher interested in the foundational debates of the cognitive science. In his PhD research, he's studying the predict processing theory of mind as a modeling framework. He argues that theories of the mind, such as the considered one, do not cut across mental kind, and therefore neither they reify scientific models into mental mechanism. He studied his bachelor and master's in philosophy at the Pontifical Catholic University of Peru, focusing on phenomenology and cognitive science at the University of Vienna and Comenius University in Bratislava. He was lecturer of philosophy in several universities in Peru. His presentation is entitled Epistemic Issues of the Transfer of Phenomenological and Cognitive Science Models of Perception. You can start when
All right.
you want.
Thank you so much, Luz, for introducing me. I need to check my presentation. All right. Can you see my slides and hear me properly? I guess so, right? In that case, well, thanks again for introducing me, Luz. And so epistemic issues of the transfers of phenomenological and cognitive science models. Thank you so much for coming to this talk. First of all, I would like to apologize because the work I'm presenting today is pretty much a work in progress. So I do not have a clear conclusion yet, but what I'm going to do is following Sean Gallagher and Dan Zahavi's book, Phenomenological Mind. I am going to try to untangle the idea that cognitive science and phenomenology can establish interdisciplinary work. And what I'm going to suggest is that this interdisciplinary work can take place through the transfer of theoretical tools and concepts. And this is going to be the topic of my presentation. So to be more specific, oh, no, just a second. It's fine on here. All right. All right, to be more specific, I'm going to divide this presentation in 4 parts. So in the first part, I am going to briefly characterize phenomenological models as reflective analysis of experiences following Lester and Bray. And I'm going to introduce an example of a phenomenological model made by Matthew Radcliffe. This is a model of depression. And in the second part, I am going to present a phenomenological model of perception, one presented in the book from Zahavi and Gallagher. In the third part, I am going to present a cognitive science model of perception, which comes from the predictive processing framework. Of course, I'm going to first say a few words about what this framework proposes. And in the last part, I will try to discuss the question of how can phenomenology and cognitive science models complement each other? So let's start by phenomenological models as reflective analysis of experiences. And I would like to make a few comments about what why phenomenology can be, how it can be interdisciplinary. So if we can understand phenomenology either as a philosophy, and when we understand it in this specific sense, in the transcendental sense, it does not have the function or the purpose of increasing the empirical or the scientific knowledge of reality, or at least it doesn't do so in a direct manner. But according to some phenomenologists such as Dan Zahavi, it can, however, serve scientific endeavors, as it can contribute to the clarification and clarify the foundations of empirical or scientific knowledge. So one question is, of course, how a phenomenology can do this. And one possible answer I found is in the article from, oh no, I'm having some problems with my scrolling the slides, so just a second. Oh, no. Okay. Yeah. So one possible answer to this question of how it can contribute, I found it in the article Interdisciplinarity within Phenomenology from Lester Embre. And he says, or he tells, I began more clearly to recognize not only how in the course of a century our tradition has spread across the planet, but also how it was pursued in an over score of non-philosophical disciplines, namely architecture, behavioral geography, cognitive science, communicology, dance, ecology, economics, education, ethnic studies, ethology, film, hermeneutics, literature, music, nursing, political science, psychiatry, psychology, religion, social geography, sociology, and theater. I keep finding more and more disciplines beyond philosophy with phenomenological tendencies, if not schools of thought within them. So Lester Embre distinguishes two orientations of phenomenology: a philosophical phenomenology, or called by Husserl transcendental, and phenomenologies oriented towards the phenomena that are studied by sciences, for example, in the case of psychiatry or sociology. And he'll suggest that disciplinary-oriented phenomenology and the philosophical one, they share in common that both are a reflective analysis of experiences, and they can help in clarifying the phenomena studied by other disciplines. And what they do as opposition to the scientific approaches to phenomena is to offer a non-reductive description of the phenomena studied by science, as I will try to show using an example from the Phenomenology of Matthew Radcliffe. So I think it's important to mention that in the description from Embre, he did not mention any natural science, except perhaps for psychology, if we consider psychology to be a natural science, which is sometimes the case. But within the human and social sciences, there are still significant differences among the theoretical resources that are transferred from phenomenology. For instance, it is not the same to transfer phenomenological model of a generic phenomenon, let's say empathy, to a different domain than transferring a specific or a domain-specific model of behavior, such as depression, to psychiatry. So there are different kinds of phenomenological models. There are models that are more general. There are models that are more specific. But I think for the practitioner of phenomenological analysis, the analysis of a domain-oriented phenomenon, let's say the analysis of depression, as in the example I'm going to present, has to be informed by phenomenology of more general objects, such as a phenomenology of perception, or a phenomenology of interaction, or even a phenomenology of the feeling of being in the world. But this is not necessarily, the opposite is not necessarily true. So a phenomenology of perception or of interaction can inform a phenomenology of depression, but not necessarily vice versa. So let me illustrate this point using the example of Radcliffe's phenomenology of depression. He emphasizes the centrality of interpersonal experience in depression and characterizes depression as a disconnection from the world inspired by Heideggerian phenomenology. So he works by using some memoirs, but also by using questionnaires. I'm going to focus on two memoirs. So the first is from Tracy Thompson. So she said that she tells, I want a connection I couldn't have. I did not understand or value the ones I did have. It was a story I saw time and time again in the world. Only connect. Foster had written, but he hadn't or couldn't or never had. There was a doctor lost in his personal torment, or Heather grasping for superficial symbols of connectedness, or Louisa looking for it through sex. It seemed to me the basic definition of any mental illness, this persistent, painful inability to simply be with someone else. It might be lifelong. So Radcliffe tells that in this and many other testimonies, as well as in first-person accounts, depression is characterized as an inability to connect with other people in a certain way, or an inability to connect with others more generally. And then he presents the memoir from Sally Brampton, who writes, if we connect with even one other human being who truly understands, we take one step out of the illness. Life is about connection. There's nothing else. Depression is the opposite. It is an illness defined by alienation. So, basically, the idea here is that, like, if we think about a very specific phenomenon through the phenomenological lens, what we get is various different structures of our being in the world involved in this phenomenon, and perhaps we can disclose and notice aspects of it that are not sometimes are leave aside in the scientific approach to these problems. And in this case, Radcliffe mentions the case of the relevance of the interpersonal, but he also characterizes depression as a transformation of our being in the world. And he tells that those who have recovered from depression often state that it remains difficult or impossible to describe. Although the difficulty might be well attributable to a range of factors, a prominent and consistent theme is that depression involves the profound, all-enveloping transformation of a world that was previously taken for granted, or something that people seldom reflect upon or even acknowledge in other circumstances. So what he ultimately seeks to explain is, or what he tries to do is to characterize depression as a disconnection from the world. And he tells that my suggestion is that the world that is altered in depression correspond broadly to the experiential world that phenomenology seeks to investigate. Hence, we can draw insights from phenomenology in order to characterize something that is otherwise elusive. To do so, we first require a more specific account of what this world actually consists of. Importantly, it is quite unlike any experience or thought about something within the world. The world is not taken to be the case in the same manner as an object of perception or belief. Its acceptance is instead a precondition for attitudes of believing, perceiving, and so forth. So if Radcliffe is on the right track, phenomenology does indeed contribute in our understanding of phenomena by study by psychiatrists. And what it does is to make explicit some of the unnoticed aspects of this phenomena when they approach, of course, through the reductivist heuristics that scientists use. And I'm going to say a few words about this when we consider cognitive science models. And what is important also in his analysis is that it shows that generic phenomenological models, in this case, a model of being in the world, can be informative for domain-centered phenomenology, such as the phenomenology of depression. And just to close this part, Embre mentions that what this analysis have in common is to be reflective, descriptive, and cultural appreciative. This type of analysis are reflective, basically because they make explicit observations about what a subject encounters in her experiences, normally beliefs, values, desires, for example. And they are descriptive analysis because they inform about what is experienced in such acts. And phenomenology says that they are, we experience essences, concepts, emotions, sentiments, fictional and real entities. And Embre adds that they are cultural appreciative because they make explicit that the knowledge we have about the world is grounded in a natural but also in a sociocultural world that is basically grounding any experience. And for this reason, Embre says that the typical procedure in phenomenology is to begin from something that is familiar, let's say a depressive behavior, and then reflecting, analyzing how it is experienced, how it is encountered, and then we can for sure rely on what people says about this and not just on our singular experience, and then express a richer comprehension of the phenomenon or the thing in question. In this case, we find that like interpersonal experience or disconnection from the world are important to this phenomenon. So, and now I would like to present a more specific phenomenological model of perception that in my understanding can enrich the scientific understanding of this phenomenon. And so the model I present here corresponds to the sketch of a phenomenology of perception presented by Gallagher and Zahavi book, Phenomenological Mind. So in this book, the authors tell that the phenomenological analysis of intentionality leads to a number of insights. For example, the intentionality of perception is richly detailed in the following sense. When I see a particular object in the street, I see it as my car. Perception is not a simple reception of information. Rather, it involves an interpretation, which frequently changes according to context. And to see my car as my car already suggests that perception is informed by previous experience. And at least in this sense, Locke and the empiricists were correct to suggest that perception is educated by experience. One should think of this as perception enriched by experience and by habitual, as well as customary ways of experiencing things, rather than as a case of perception plus thought. It is not that I perceive X and then add something quite different and novel, namely the thought that this is my car. One way to put this is to say that perception is smart. or perception is interpretational. But the point here is that I see the car already as my car. And I think it is worth noticing that the phenomenological analysis of perception does not adopt the reductive or deductionist heuristics that science adopt for methodological reasons. One of these strategies is mentioned here and says that perception is not simple reception of information, which is sometimes an analogy that like cognitive scientists use. And the analogy roundly consists in comparing a perception with a behavior that is better understood or better comprehended. And the behavior I refer is the behavior of computing machines. So the idea is that, like in the cognitive science, for methodological reasons we can discuss in a minute, there is the analogy between perceptual acts and the acts of a computing machine that receives information, processes it, and get visual scenes from this. And this analogy, as I'm also going to argue, helps different kind of purposes. If you want to create like a machine that simulates perceptual behavior, then it makes sense to adopt these kinds of heuristics. Or if you want to study perception from the perspective of processing of information, and you want to learn something about how the brain processes information, then it makes sense to adopt these analogies. But Gallagher and Zahavi tell that unlike the cognitive sciences, in the case of phenomenology, we do not accept this this analogy, and rather approach perception as an act or as an intentional act, which is smart because it is not about receiving information and transforming it into something else, but it is about recognizing the objects as part of a meaningful world. So the second aspect of perception they emphasize is that, well, it is precisely an intelligent or cognitive act. This is an interesting aspect. The idea is that perception involves, as we already read, a component of interpretation that is shaped by past experiences, but also by the body. They both shape the way we perceive objects. They tell perception smart, it's already meaningful. In part, this means that it is already enriched by the circumstances and possibilities of my embodied existence and surrounding environment. The phenomenologists would say that perceptual experience is embedded in contexts that are pragmatic, social, and cultural, and that much of the semantic world, the formation of perceptual meaning, is facilitated by the objects, arrangements, and events that I encounter. In a particular instance, I might see the object as a practical vehicle that I can use to get me to where I'm going. In another instance, I might see the exact same object as something I have to clean, or as something I have to sell, or as something that is not working properly. The way that I see my car will depend on a certain contextual background, which can also be explored phenomenologically. So here they also are differentiating perception from a kind of mental representation. And as they already mentioned, it is not that I first perceive and then I perceive, let's say, or I have sensory experiences, and then I associate them, and then I come with something that I perceive as meaningful. It's not the idea that perception plus thought give me a representation of the world. And the argument Gallagher and well, mostly both of them stress here is that, like, much of the semantic work of perception is offloaded into a meaningful world. And then the idea is that, like, in perception, we perceive meaningful things, and this is thanks in part to the bodily dimension of perception. So, and following this example, they further characterize perception as an embodied act. The idea is that to encounter my car as something to drive is to encounter it as something I can climb into, as something located in a place that affords the kind of motion the car is built for. My perceptual experience will consequently be informed by the bodily abilities and skills I possess. It has been customary to say that perception has representational or conceptual content, but perhaps this way of talking fails to fully capture the situated nature of perceptual experience. Rather than saying that I represent the car as drivable, it might be better to say that given the design of the car, the shape of my body, and its action possibilities, and the state of the environment, the car is drivable and I perceive it as such. So apart from being informed by past experience and the structure of the body, perception is also shaped by the structure of the environment and is a temporal act. And as such, perceptual acts anticipate what we could say upcoming experiences or upcoming sensory data, or even like the anticipations we have in perception in a way shape what we are going to experience. And they say that the intentional structure of perception involves spatial aspects that can be explored phenomenologically. My embodied position places precise limitations on what I can see and what I can't. From where I am standing, I can see the driver's side of the car. The car appears in that profile and in such a way that what I do see of the car occludes other aspects or profiles of the car. Standing where I am, I cannot literally see the passenger side of the car, for example. It is not in my visual field. Nonetheless, I see the car as having another side to it, and I would be extremely surprised if I walk around the car and found that the passenger side was missing. The surprise that I would feel indicates that I have a certain tacit anticipation of what my possible action in the immediate future will bring. I am surprised because my anticipation is disappointed. So, one last aspect concerns the temporality of perception. The idea is basically that perception doesn't occur all at once, but it's rather temporal. And in the case of perception of objects, the speciality of perception means that I only see objects on partial manners, but the idea is that perception as a synthetic act reunites these different aspects or moments into the recognition of a single entity or a state of affairs depending on the situation. So the temporal act is always incomplete as the object cannot be seen completely, but perception involves a synthesis of different moments. So they tell us in any perception of a physical object, my perception is always incomplete in regard to the object. I never see a complete object all at once. Let's call this perspectival incompleteness. There's always something more to see that is implicit there, even in the perception of the simplest object. If I move around a tree in order to obtain a more exhaustive perception of it, then the various profiles of the tree, its front, sides, and back, do not present themselves as disjointed fragments, but are perceived as synthetically integrated moments. This synthetic process is one, again, temporal in nature. So, to sum up, a phenomenological model of perception, of course, is empowered in Husserl and other phenomenologists, basically describes how an embodied agent that lives in a physical and sociocultural world perceives objects. And what is important of this analysis in comparison to scientific models of perception is that it identifies different kinds of structures that are often unnoticed when you use reductivist strategies to account for this phenomenon. And these aspects are its intentionality, its perspectival incompleteness, its phenomenal character, and its temporal character. So unlike phenomenology, cognitive science intends to account for perception on a different way, as I'm gonna try to show now. We could say that a general difference between the approach from phenomenology and the approach of cognitive science is concerns that phenomenology is not necessarily interested in the brains behind the experience. This is how they put this. And it's rather concerned with attaining an understanding and proper description, this is important, of the experiential structure of our mental or embodied life. It does not attempt to develop a naturalistic explanation of consciousness, nor does it seek to uncover its biological genesis, neurological basis, psychological motivation, or the like. So unlike phenomenology, cognitive science tries to account for perception and other intelligent behavior as the result of different processes that take place in the brain or in the mind, and that can be empirically explored. So then they adopt different kinds of strategies to address these problems in an empirical fashion. And also, neither cognitive scientists separate this embodied life from the neural processes that make people perceive in the way they do. So at this point, the audience might wonder, let's say, if we have mechanistic models from the cognitive science, how mechanistic or other kinds of cognitive science models of perception can be relevant for phenomenology, and how does a phenomenological model be relevant for modeling perception in cognitive science? So with these questions in mind, let me just briefly concentrate on the second question. And so how can a phenomenological model be relevant for modeling perception in cognitive science? One way also we found it in Gallagher and Zahavi, I forget to quote here, but it's I call this way a description of the explanandum, or of the object we are trying to explain. So they say that phenomenological accounts are not irrelevant for science of perception, and the reason is that, like, well, there is currently a growing realization that we will not get very far in giving a scientific account of the relationship between consciousness and the brain unless we have a clear conception of what it is that we are trying to relate. So, for instance, in naturalistic approaches to problems such as consciousness, if we try to naturalize consciousness, the answer is, well, we first need to properly understand it, and phenomenology can contribute in this way. For instance, in a naturalization of consciousness in this project, a project like this require a detailed analysis and description of the experiential aspects of consciousness. As Nagel once pointed out, a necessary requirement for any coherent reductionism is that the entity to be reduced is properly understood. And in my opinion, if we don't do this, we get like self-fulfilling prophecies in science. If we check or we do a Google research on self-fulfilling prophecies in science, we tend to find out that, like, experiments tend to have this characteristic in many cases. So the idea of phenomenology is, of course, not to offer an empirical description of this phenomena, but the phenomenological analysis of intentionality, spatiality, temporality, and the different aspects of perception can indeed give a different or can complement the analysis of psychologists, of neuroscientists, precisely because it's a more richer understanding of the phenomena they are considering. It's not this is not to say that like the phenomenology should ask the scientists not to adopt reductionist strategies, but it is more about framing on a more careful way the object they are trying to investigate. So now I would like to shift towards a cognitive science model of perception. So, and unlike the phenomenological model, this model is purposefully reductionist, and but I would try to, I'm going to first present it, and then I'm going to try to explain how these models can complement each other, or at least how do I understand this complementarity of models. So a predictive processing model of perception. Well, first I need to explain broadly what predictive processing is about. And fortunately, Vania Bisse and Thomas Metzinger have a quite nice article called Vanilla PP for Philosophers, which is an introduction of the predictive processing framework targeting philosophers. And well, I'm going to read this first, and then I'll try to untangle what this is about. Predictive processing is a framework involving a general computational principle which can be applied to describe perception, action, cognition, and their relationship in a single conceptually unified manner. So first of all, important to say is that frameworks are not exactly theories. Frameworks are let's say, if you think about, like, let's say, if you think about a theory of how the brain processes of information, that you are talking about a very specific causal mechanism that behaves on a regular manner and produces certain kind of observable behavior. But when we are talking about frameworks in cognitive science, we're talking about something that is more general. And so if we want to study the mind scientifically, we have several problems or several issues in cognitive science. One of these issues is that, like, the mind is not something that can be directly observed as such. We do not observe cognition, we observe cognitive acts. And what the cognitive scientists do is to create indirect representations that are called models. To understand or to represent something as a mental act, we need a model that has certain structure. And this structure, we tend to use it as an analogy to study cognitive behavior. And this is why there is the need of different kinds of analogies. For instance, the mind as a machine, or the mind as a computer system. These are basic analogies that cognitive scientists use to study the mind or cognition, because we cannot observe it as we observe, let's say, different kinds of things in the natural world. We need these analogies. And frameworks in cognitive science offer rich analogies, or more or less consistent analogies to study cognitive behavior. The first analogy is between minds and computers, and this analogy came or originate, I think, in the 1950s. It was an influence of the cybernetician movement to the cognitive science, and the basic idea is that of this paradigm or framework, let's say, is that we can analogize the mind with a computing machine that processes inputs and turns it into outputs. But there are other frameworks in cognitive sciences. There are a framework known as connectionism that basically says that, the mind is not like a machine that basically is following rules, but it's more complex because it operates on a parallel distributing processing. It means that like the mind processes several tasks at the same time and not just a single rule, and it has a kind of soft way of computing. And predictive processing suggests something different, suggests a computational principle in which minds are intelligent because they are permanently anticipating the contents of the environment, and they are learning from what they predict and what they don't. They sometimes learn from their mistakes. And predictive processing presents this computational principle and applies it to different phenomena such as perception, action, dreaming, and so on. So basically what it does is to present a computational architecture through which we can model perception, we can model action, and many other cognitive phenomena, including mental disorders, as in some articles. There has been many attempts to try to explain basically any cognitive behavior with this model. Of course, there are different kinds of acceptation of this framework. There's people saying that the mind predicts, and in any kind of act, there are people that like me, which are more skeptic about the big claims that people, the researchers claiming that like the way our brain processes information is predictive, which is let's say a naturalistic way of looking at the cognitive science framework. In my opinion, we shouldn't look at frameworks in this realistic way, and we should rather look at them as modeling tools. But in any case, even for proponents of predictive processing, when we are talking about this framework, we're talking about a computational principle. I'm going to say more things about this later, but sometimes this framework is confused with a theory of how certain neural processes give rise to any cognitive behavior. So here it's also important to mention that, like in cognitive science, we often follow Mars levels of analysis. And so the idea of Mars is that, like, when we look at a cognitive behavior, we represent it as a threefold, or we can analyze it in a threefold, in three ways. We can analyze a cognitive behavior as a computational thing, as a computational, from a computational perspective, sorry. And then what we are basically doing is describing a task, a computational task that can be done by, by a machine. And then if we look, for instance, of perception as a computational task, then we basically have some components of a machine, and the components will be, let's say, you have inputs, you have certain processes, and then you have an output. In the case of perception, could be, for instance, the input could be sensory inputs, and you have different separated sensory inputs, and the task is to use these inputs to get a perception of a scene, or a perception of a face. And then the question is how this computational task is achieved. And then it comes the second level of analysis, which Mark calls algorithmic. And basically the algorithmic level of analysis tells how a machine can relate these different inputs by means of using several rules into the desired output. And the last level, level is the implementational level. And the implementational level basically tells us how a physical system, such as the brain, can implement this information processing task that has been previously described as computational and as an algorithmic process. And in this third level of description, there it comes, the neural processes. Predictive processing, as I mentioned before, is not directly a theory about the implementation of this predictive machinery in our brains, but it can serve to make a specific scientific models about this. And then we talk about predictive coding rather than predictive processing. Bisa and Metzinger tell us that, like, the principle, I will talk a little bit more about this principle in a moment, can be applied to descriptions of the subpersonal, computational, or neurobiological levels of analysis, and can also be applied to descriptions on the personal level, agentive phenomena, the structure of reasoning, or phenomenological reports which describe content of consciousness. And this is important to say because important scholars working on predictive processing, like Jacob Howe, they often claim that, like, predictive processing can account for the phenomenology of perception. I am not completely, I'm a bit skeptical on these kinds of claims, because what predictive processing is doing is to offer a computational principle which when describe neural processes is not describing how it is like to predict or so, but some authors disagree with this view. In any case, important to say is that, like, a primer of cognitive information processing. And so since the inception of the cognitive revolution, the origin of the cognitive science, the brain has often been conceptualized as an information processing device that implements a series of serial transformations from input or stimuli to internal representations, or sometimes outputs or actions. Or, as William James put it, a machine for converting stimuli into reactions. So this perspective prompts the idea that cognition consists in computing the response to stimuli, also known as computationalism, and its most important aspects, the truly cognitive processes, are placed in between perception and action systems. So, as a framework, what predictive processing does is to explain this gap between stimuli and reaction, or also action. Let's say stimuli into perception, a stimuli into dreaming, and so on. What predictive processing tries to do is to fill this gap by providing an architecture that can be applied to study empirically many different cognitive phenomena. So, but there are, of course, other architectures on the market. The question is, well, why this architecture can be or is interesting at all. So, before predictive processing, most models of cognitive processing of information were passive accumulation models. So this is what is predictive processing against to. So in the passive accumulation models, we basically have a representation of the brain that is doing different kinds of cognitive tasks, but essentially does these tasks on a bottom-up fashion. Let's use this example. So these abbreviations are B1, B2, are different areas of the visual cortex. Then we have the inferior posterior sulcus and the anterior. And well, this graphical representation basically is about how is supposed, how the information processing is supposed to take place in our brain. So when we talk about bottom-up feature detection, we are trying to say basically that, well, to perceive these scenes like this one, basically we need to we first decompose the scenes. We don't directly perceive them as wholes. We perceive them as small elements. We process and synthesize these elements through our visual cortex. Our visual cortex proceeds and aggregates these different elements, and then like the memory system associate these features with concepts, and then we get somehow a kind of recognition of objects in the world. It says, a familiar view depicts perception as essentially a process of bottom-up feature detection. Thus, in the case of vision, detected color, edges, and shapes might act as building blocks for detected objects, cat, dogs, and states of affairs. Dogs chasing a cat, perhaps. So the bottom-up feature detection model is basically what predictive processing contests. And basically it does so by proposing a hierarchical model of visual information processing. So the idea essentially is that it is not the case that when we are perceiving, we need to aggregate these different small elements into composite blocks until we recognize it. This is not what happens in perception according to predictive processing. What happens in perception is that, like, from the very beginning, the mind and the brain is actively sending information from the top areas to that modulate the way we process information in the bottom up manner. So the idea is that, like, our anticipations of experience are constantly shaping, and then they are like offloading this need for processing bottom-up information. And this model indeed can explain some interesting facts, like, for instance, how we often perceive, but then we don't have a kind of calibrated perception unless we start paying attention to the objects. But this is more or less the idea of a hierarchy. We come up with a range of meaningful information that is shaping the way we perceive objects on a bottom-up manner. So the idea is that, like, perception is not just bottom up, it's not just aggregative, but it also is top down, if we want to say it with these terms. So what are predictions? I think Clark has a nice way of describing this. He says that it is the kind of automatically deployed, deeply probabilistic, non-conscious guessing that occurs as part of the neural processing routines that underpin perception and action. Predictions, in this later sense, is something brains do to enable embodied, environmentally situated agents to carry out various tasks. So if we think about the notion of phenomenology, that the perception has a component of anticipation, therefore the predictive model would basically tell us that this component of anticipation is also reflected in the way we process information. So the idea, as Hermenio Ainsa puts it, is that the brain mediates with the world and the environment, not by detecting features, but via a kind of predictive control in which the meaningful world is already the knowledge or the meaning we have about the world is shaping the way we perceive and we act. So this is the outfielder problem he uses as an example in this in the article Radical Predictive Processing. So in the case of the outfielder, so the outfielder has to calculate, or has to estimate where is the ball is going to land. And so the idea is that, like, when the outfielder is moving, but by moving or by acting, it gets a better guess about where the ball is going to land. If you ask an outfielder to solve this problem while quiet, it would be hard for she or her of him. So just a second.
Maybe you can start finishing your
Yeah,
paper.
I will finish soon, Luz. So basically, just to make it, to keep it short, the idea of predictive processing is that all these this task of, or all this predictive work is done because we kind of have a kind of model of the environment that we learn, and basically this model allows us to basically associate sensory signals with fully perceived or meaningful objects. I'm not going to talk a little more about this because of time constraints, but I have to tell something about the computational principle that does this activity. So the idea of predictive processing is that we anticipate sensory signals based on a model of the world, and what the brain does is, instead of processing each single unit of information in the world, it rather only processes the mismatch between predictions and sensory evidence in a computational, following a computational principle called prediction error minimization. So what the brain does ultimately is just to minimize prediction error. So this framework basically gives us the picture of perception as a kind of inference. This image also comes from Helmholtz, but it has been somehow modified by predictive processing proponents. So the idea of perceptual inference, we can appreciate it quite easily using the example of the Canizas figures. And what is interesting of the Canizas figures is that a contour is perceived in these figures. So there is no explicit one, but like by looking at them, a square and a triangle pop out. And well, the thing is that why this happens if we actually don't have the contour. Or there is also this image from Andy Clark, which is basically, you have here a 13 and a B, and depending on the way depending on where you start looking at, you get different meaning. So this is also a way we can think about perception as inference. That this is the model of perception that comes from predictive processing, but we have to remember that we shouldn't take inference as seriously here. So the idea is that perceptual experiences and beliefs arise as a result of the brain attempt at predicting sensory input on the basis of a large amount of stored knowledge. So basically, when we talk about predictive processing, we are talking about perceptual and active inference, about prediction error minimization, and the idea that we model the environment in order to learn from it. So just to briefly summarize, to conclude my presentation, I'm going to try to be quick here. Final remarks: how can a phenomenological and cognitive models complement each other? So one way could be, well, this is already known in experimental designs, and well, Gallagher and Zahavi says something about this. And the idea is that in order to design experiments properly and in order to interpret their results, experimenters often want to know what the subject life experience is alike. Again, the issue of methodology calls for some consideration of dependable ways of describing conscious experience, and phenomenology offers just such a method. But in a more relevant way, in my opinion, is by clarifying the explanandum of the sciences. And we already showed that, like in the case of models of perception, phenomenology can indeed give a rich, detailed analysis of different dimensions of perception that are often overlooked in the heuristic, reductionist heuristics of science. And just to conclude, well, this is already is work in progress, but from the predictive processing framework, Ramstead and Carl Friston and their colleagues have been recently write this article called from generative models to generative passages, a computational approach to neurophenomenology, in which they are starting applying computational methods to phenomenology. So the idea is that like models that the predictive processing model could serve to describe on a formal level different experiential structures of phenomenology, but perhaps we could discuss this further on the questions. Sorry for the delay, and thank you for listening to my talk. All right.
Thank you so much for this presentation, this excellent and interesting presentation. Maybe we have some questions. You can write your questions in the chat or just turn on your microphone and make your question.
Hola, ¿me escuchan?
Hola.
Hola, Azul, ¿qué tal? Lindo verte.
Mucho gusto. Qué bueno verlos. Bueno, I can switch to English, but sorry, I haven't spoken any English in like 3 years, so sorry for this. But I have a question for Rafael. Thank you for your exposition. I have a lot of questions. I think the discussion is just starting. I hope we can speak a lot more in the future, but for the moment I have one question to raise. I have the feeling that these complementary models that you are talking about between phenomenology and the cognitive sciences is a little bit restricted to static phenomenology and doesn't consider the progress of later Husserlian phenomenology, specifically the genetic turn. And I wanted to ask you if you think, if you would agree that these cognitive sciences would complement with the early analysis of Husserlian phenomenology. Closer, specifically closer to the psychological period. So even pre-transcendental phenomenology. What I mean is this model, this perceptual model you're talking about in phenomenology seems a bit not very developed, like a model from the electic analytic model and illemorphism model. Where consciousness interprets matter, but I think phenomenology, specifically genetic phenomenology, goes farther. So I have my doubts that cognitive sciences dialogues with this later phenomenology. So it's not just it's a comment, but it's maybe I didn't.
I mean, I am not against what you're saying, to be honest. I remember that there is an article from Dan Zahavi in 2007. He writes about predictive coding, which is the neurological oriented application of predictive processing. And basically what he does, he basically says that like they should look into the history of well, the people that were discussing or where Husserl was trying to discuss, the neo-Kantians, in the sense of predictive processing presents a picture in which the brain is self-evidencing and it's making predictions and it's confirming its subjective real, but it does not catch the what is out there. It's just like, let's say you have predictions and then you learn from your mistakes, but you ultimately are confined within mental representations. So I think that the reading that Zahavi makes here is a bit perhaps incorrect, but why? Because he's reading this project as if it would be a phenomenology or a philosophical description of perception. Which I argue that this is not the case of cognitive science models. So cognitive science models are not describing what perception is. It is more a perspective, like let's say cyberneticians make this characterization quite nicely. So they say that, well, let's say when you approach a phenomenon or a system and you approach it as a machine, the purpose is not to make, like, let's say, a bona fide representation of reality. So when you look at something as a machine, you're not trying basically to say that, well, perhaps perception functions as a kind of mechanic behavior. You basically look at in this way to gain control or to make predictions about a phenomenon. So this is interesting for the interdisciplinary transfer between phenomenology and the cognitive science, because even if you're trying to control a phenomenon through a reductionist strategy, you still need a better representation of the phenomenon into the consideration. And that's why I was trying to argue that phenomenology provides precisely this clarification of the explanandum that sometimes is needed for scientists. And so, yeah, I mean, regarding the question of whether this collaboration is confined to static phenomenology, I would disagree, because I would say that genetic phenomenology and perhaps this emphasis on the on embodied cognition is also goes beyond the static phenomenology, but like the approach is, of course, as I mentioned you before, is rather systemic or mechanic rather than properly phenomenological. But that doesn't mean that it cannot be complement the other. And it complements in the sense that, like, if phenomenology doesn't have the tools to exploring the Körper, I think that's the word, then well sciences do this, and then, like, why shouldn't they try to look at the phenomenon from different angles? Yeah, that would be my answer. I don't know if you have more questions, or maybe if I'm answering you properly. Well, thank you for asking.
Thank you so much to both of you. Does we have another question? Hi, Rosemary.
Hi, Luz. Hi, Rafael. Thank you for your talk. I appreciated it a lot. Also because you began making reference to Nestor Embry. I wanted to show you that there's an encyclopedia of phenomenology, which he published in 1999. The paper that you have quoted is from 2010, I believe. Yeah. But that's very, very, very appropriate for the transferring that we're addressing here in this series of talks. Something very, very specific I want to ask you, no? Because the language that cognitive sciences use, of course, it's a scientific language, and as such, it's a very rational language. And there are two expressions that I question whether they're appropriate to describe the phenomenon, the perceptual phenomenon. No, for example, when you put that graphic of the perceptual model, perceptual inference, so you use inference, no, for perceptual experiences. You cited here, quoted here, Geisen, 2018, perceptual experience beliefs arise as a result of the brain's attempt at predicting. Okay, so it's inference and prediction, okay? Now, these words, inference, is a rational procedure, a conscious, rational procedure, and then prediction also. So when you use these words, you are assuming that, I mean, you have a perfectly conscious perceptual apparatus, perfectly conscious and also rational, no? Whereas these perception in general for the phenomenological approach is in the middle, no, of a passive process and the beginning, the arisal of a conscious process that culminates in a rational process. So it's a temporal process. It's also a teleological in this genetic sense. There's no break. There are no strata that have a hiatus between them. No, it's a process that goes from passivity, from unconscious. Of course, cognitive science, and you have mentioned in another graphic, I didn't copy the graphic, but it's from unknown sources, something like that you mentioned, from obscure and unknown. Well, in phenomenology, of course, it's not static phenomenology. Phenomenology is genetic, no? You have to, so I think genetic is good to compare with cognitive. But the way things are described seem to me a little inadequate, no? In the sense that this passage from unconscious associative processes that are later consciously reconstructed in order to understand how we arrive to our conscious. And so prediction in a phenomenological sense is what appears as, in a very, very primitive level, as protension, no? And then when the perceptive level, which is in the middle, it's when consciousness appears at the perceptual level, then you have expectation, but it's not a prediction, no? So perception is sort of associative, sort of automatic, but you also have, or you already conscious, there are perceptual meanings, no, that are starting to appear there. So it's a language, no? That would be one thing. And then the other thing, I think that
maybe I can reply to this first, and then we continue, because then it would be perhaps too much information for the audience. Okay. So I think as far as I get you, the first point is the problem of how they describe the phenomenon. And yeah, of course, I agree with you and that's precisely what I tried, why I tried to focus so much on phenomenology as offering better descriptions of the phenomenon into consideration. So that's something that, like, I mean, has also been stressed very much by Zahavi and Gallagher. And well, this is not because scientists are trying to do bad descriptions of phenomena, but it's because of a strategy. The strategy is this reductionist heuristics. So you basically find that, like, if you want to gain control over a phenomenon, then you have to simplify it into, like, let's say, into systems that can have a kind of repetitive behavior. And you do this by constructing models or by using analogies. So perceptual inference is one of these analogies. So this analogy was invented by Helmholtz in the 19th century when studying visual perception. And even for Helmholtz, he says that, well, you have this kind of logical structure with the, you know, the structure from Aristotle from inference, when you get like the major premise, the minor premise, and then you get a kind of conclusion. And he of course acknowledged that, well, this is just like a bad analogy I use because I don't have a better one. So but there is a kind of long history about how this concept of inference is taken in more recent times. And I did not mention this of the presentation because of time, but like there's people like neuroscientists, neuroimaginist, physicist Carl Friston, who takes this on a more on a different level. He does not talk only about perceptual inference, but also about active inference. So the idea is that you can represent a cognitive system as a system that is basically making expectations about how the world looks like in this perceptual inference, but it also acts in order to transform this world into what expectations into the world of its expectations. And sometimes so this is of course an analogy, and that the reason he talks about inference in this context is not to say that, like, well, we infer in reality. It's because inference is an important concept using Bayesian statistics, which are the kind of statistics that ground the different models of predictive processing and also the models they use. So basically, it's a technical term, but it's not meant to say that the perceptual acts are in reality inferential. And concerning, you also mentioned the topic of teleology, because and I also mentioned Carl Friston because of this. So what he tries to do is to represent cognitive agents that as homeostatic agents, but that find homeostasis not just by like maintaining their states into, you know, certain kind of but by not moving, to put it in a non-formal way, but basically they maintain their homeostasis by actively transforming their environment. So this is another way of looking at teleology, but like what they offer, or at least what they promise to offer, is to have a mathematical description for this teleological real. And yeah, I mean, and regarding the topic of predictions, I mean, at least Andy Clark, he says that, like, when we talk about predictions here, we're talking about non-conscious guesses. So it might be part of protation, but certainly the model of cognition that predictive processing endorses is hierarchical, which means that it's a multi-level model, just like the phenomenological idea of you have conscious levels in which the ways of proceeding are different than the more subconscious level. So what has been the case is that like proponents of predictive processing, such as Carl Friston, they tend to relate this conscious description of experience in predictive processing with classic mental representationalism and theories of mind. And then they basically reify many prejudices about how the mind works, in my opinion. But like this has shifted in the recent years, also because of people like Sean Gallagher, who are trying to have or to enter a dialogue with predictive processing. Yeah, that would be my answers, I hope. Yeah.
May I add a small thing? You started with examples of depression.
Yeah.
Okay, so I was thinking the transfer or the complementary work, no, of cognitive sciences, philosophy of mind, phenomenology, neurophenomenology, as was first presented by Valera, no? He presented it as not one confirming the other, but working in a common cause from different perspectives. Now, the question of the example of depression makes me think in the emotional component that integrates perception. No, what you see is also emotionally tainted. So not only neurophenomenology, but also cardiophenomenology, which is the work of Nathalie Desprat. I think you should take that into consideration, because what that contributes to phenomenological transfers, no, I think is important, even for these cognitive processes such as perception.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree that, yeah, for sure, it's a component I did not study it because of time, but yeah, certainly it's something that is part of perception. Thank you, Rosemary.
Thank you so much for this discussion. We have another question, but we have also the second presentation. Maybe Alexandra Mierkov, could you make your question very in a short way? And
yes,
Rafael,
it is a very short one. Thank you so much. And my question is, in fact, a continuation of the previous question. So, of Rosemary. Thank you so much, Rosemary, that you brought in discussion the concept of unconscious and irrationality. So it's a very short and weird question. Thank you, Rafael, for your presentation. So my question is, where do you place in this effort of putting together two different ways of approaching knowledge and truth, the phenomenological one and the scientific one? Where do you put in this effort the unconscious desire of the scientist? The unconscious desire of the scientist. Thank you so much.
But I mean, that's a difficult one. But what I can say that like is that what happens many times in scientific practice is that like there is not such a thing like a proper assessment of what is the scientist doing, and so you can of course take a model of perception, and using this model you can study visual perception on a more or less direct manner. And let's say you adopt the bottom-up feature detection model I mentioned before, and if you take the model seriously, which is often the case, then you come up, of course, with results, but that are kind of are not necessarily well assessed in respect of, well, what you're really showing, to questions like, well, what are you really demonstrating? So that is why I think it's important, this assessment of the explanando, of the thing you are trying to explain. And I think that, like, of course, phenomenology can do this for some sciences, and also philosophy of science can do this task in certain way, by kind of looking at the epistemic problems that come when you do not really look at whether in using your models you are just somehow using a kind of template to address different kinds of phenomena, but not necessarily representing the world, but rather intervening on it. And so I'm not going to talk directly about the unconscious desire of science, because I don't know about that, but what it can do is to say that, like, in many cases, a philosophical analysis of scientific practice and also of scientific concepts, it's kind of useful, because you can do better science in this way.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you so much for this passionate discussion. If you have other questions to ask to Rafael Aybar, we are going to put his email in the chat, so everyone can write to him. Great.
I will be very happy to receive as many questions as possible, and I promise to answer all of them if I can.
Thank you so much, Rafael. And right now, we are going to listen to Ilya Onegin. Hello, Ilya Onegin. Ilya Onegin is currently a PhD candidate at the HSE University of Moscow. Since she entered university, his academic interests center primarily around contemporary philosophy of mind, especially around the problem of the self. After her interests shift to phenomenology, and now Ilya Onegin, researcher, is focused on connections and tensions between phenomenology and some branches of philosophy of mind and cognitive science, especially in activism. Today, she's given a talk entitled "The Enactivism Methodological Mixture, Adding Together Husserl and Buddha."
Yes, well, there was actually a small mistake. I'm not a PhD student, I'm still an undergraduate student. Well, but nevertheless. Well,
I'm so sorry.
Can I share my demonstration?
I'm not a she. I get confused because of your name. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry.
No, it's a male name.
I'm sorry.
No problem. Can I share my demonstration? I cannot share my presentation, actually.
We are going to give you this power. Normally, you can do it right now.
Yet now I can. You see this?
Great.
You see this? Okay. Well, the theme of my presentation is, as you have said, the methodological mixture in activism. And here I shall question the validity of usage of the Husserlian methods in activism as contrasted to the use of Buddhist methods. So, as we know, the enactivist approach comprises both Husserlian's theoretical legacy and practical insights taken from Buddhism. In respect of the former, the enactivist researchers not only appreciate their focus on a direct examination of experience, but also make use of essentially Husserlian notions of intentionality and epoché, as well as utilize some more technical concepts of Husserlian phenomenology in the design of their studies, such as, for example, retention or the thorough and radical distinction between Gegenwärtigung und Vergegenwärtigung, or between Wahrnehmung und Perzeption. But they also try to conciliate Husserl's intentionality with Buddhist notions of offness or aboutness of consciousness. But however, the inactivism finds the Husserlian method insufficient in many aspects, be that the ignorance of the so-called consensual aspect and the direct embodied aspect of experience, or the more specific problems like saying little about deep and dreamless sleep. So they turn to Buddhist methods when seeking for techniques to attend flexibly to experience itself. But my aim here is to clarify the inner tensions and restrictions arising between Husserl and Buddhism that may question the suitability of the Husserl-style phenomenological approach within the inactive methodological mixture. Well, first of all, let us regard the regional Husserlian attitudes towards Buddhism. Husserl might well have been acquainted with Indian teachings since youth, as he was familiar to Hermann Ernst Gassmann, the son of Hermann Günther Gassmann, who, besides being a mathematician, published a vocabulary to Rig Veda. And Husserl was also familiar and was a friend of a prominent German Indologist, Hermann Oldenberg. But nevertheless, he was hardly ever seriously occupied with Buddhist scriptures. However, Husserl wrote some specific works on the topic of Buddhism. In a text entitled Socrates Buddha, which was supposedly written somewhat near the winter of 1925-1926, he concluded that the ancient Greek thought, on the one hand, and the Indian thought, including Buddhism, on the other, were dramatically distinct in regard to the natural attitude. He claimed that while the Greek philosophy differed from the natural attitude by virtue of its logic and method, the Indian one was essentially similar to the natural attitude in its form and method, except to interests and conclusion. According to Husserl, only Greeks saw the Endgültigkeit, or as we might say, somewhat like the ultimate validity of theory, as of the only ground of human autonomy. Meanwhile, Indians, including Buddha, were for Husserl practically autonomous. The Greeks performed the Stellungnahme, the stance taken of the world, as of sensible product of the transcendental Gestalt, as of the domain of meaning. But contrariwise, the Buddhists and the Indian on the whole pursued not the rationalizing, but the escape from the world. However, in a review on the German translation of Majjhima Nikaya, Husserl highly estimated Buddhism as religion, and only as religion, endowing it with transcendental character, although he did not make any further specifications of the title. And so he thought that the Indian teachings could have been paralleled only to the highest forms of the European spirit. Nevertheless, Husserl saw no parallels between the particularities of his own teaching and the teaching of Buddha. And for example, in the seminars of 1925, 1926, he did not ground Buddhism with something more than the dignity of universal reflection through practical life. Although for Husserl, Buddha resembled Socrates in his practical attitude. Certainly, I cannot affirm the full adequacy of Husserl's own point of view. And indeed, there are attempts to reconcile Husserlian phenomenology with what can be called Buddhist phenomenology. As, for example, Nathalie Depart pointed to, Husserlian methods of epoche and phenomenological reduction may somehow resemble those of Buddhist schools. For example, the Samatha in Chogyamto past version. So that, as she says, Samatha and epoche are targeted and stabilizing acts. Husserlian concepts of noema and noesis have been paralleled to a row of Yogacaras terms, such as respectively Grahaka and Raya, Alambaka and Alambana, etc., where the researchers acknowledge a particular richness of Buddhist phenomenological vocabulary in contrast to Husserlian one. Then the attempts were undertaken to juxtapose Husserl's definitions of phenomenology on the ND's one as of the science of essence, where essence is not substance but sense of objects, and the approach of the later Yogacara to the reality of consciousness, where the latter was nothing but the reality for itself, where the consciousness was not deemed illusionary, but real, not substantial as though. And the comparison of Yogacaras alaya, something like a storehouse of consciousness, receptacle or appropriating consciousness, with its similarly temporal character, with Husserlian notion of transcendental ego as of temporal flux. This comparison is also not worthy. But let us now see what the inactivism seeks for in the Buddhism, while simultaneously somewhat sticking to Husserlian phenomenology. As I have previously said, the global missing point of Husserl for the inactivism is its alleged abstinence from the embodied human experience. As an alternative to the disembodied phenomenological knowledge, the inactivist researchers propose mindfulness or awareness as a product of Buddhist meditation. While an ordinary human notices the tendency of the mind to wander only when one is attempting to accomplish some mental task and the wandering interferes, the Buddhist meditation allows us to clarify the mental content and proper functioning of mind, such as calming or taming the mind, shamatha, and the development of insight, vipassana, are performed. So mindfulness for the inactivism is fixation of the mental content that remains disturbed and chaotic while in the attitude of everyday life. And the implementation of such mindfulness aimed technique stand in complete opposition to the fundamentals of both Cartesian and Husserlian philosophy. The inactive approach, see it, for it is the habit of mindlessness that tempts us to speak of the mind as of something disconnected from the body. Thus, a specific kind of mind-body unity is achieved. And we can illustrate this on how the inactivism deals with the problem of perception. So to say, of how the continuous experience arises from disordered events among the neural correlates of consciousness. As Evan Thompson claims, the Abhidharma philosophers agreed that the mental stream is always changing, but they argued that it appears to flow continuously only to the untrained observer. And a deeper examination indicates that the stream of consciousness is made up of these continuous and discrete moments of awareness. And Thompson gives an example that in Abhidharma, in canonical scholastic Buddhist texts, not only some cognitive factors accompanying the perception of objects are given, but also even the least time needed for a momentary visual perception is rightly estimated at about 15 or 20 milliseconds, although very few people could display such perfection in visual observation. And this is meditation that, according to Thompson, may render everyone so perfect in observation, especially the Theravada Vipassana meditation that exhibits both focused attention and open monitoring, that is, directing attention to a particular object for quite a long time and being open to every singular coincidental perception happening in the mind. Well, here I will somewhat leave aside the inactivist focus on countlessness. It is on the obsession with foundations of knowledge that all the Western philosophy, at least since Descartes, according to the inactivists, was infected with. And the appeal to Madhyamika's notion of shunyata, that is, emptiness, voidness of consciousness, but dharmas, the constituents of consciousness, are hidden as much as they appear to be in mind. The inactivists use the notion of groundlessness, however, not directly in a sense of shunyata, but in a sense close to Nagarjuna's middle way, and thus evade both objectivism and subjectivism. And they use this concept like a border stone, designating their break with the Husserlian tradition. But how does the commitment to the Buddhist methods coexist with remnants of Husserlian activism? As it is evident, the core of the Buddhist meditation practice, as highlighted by inactivists, is the idea of fixation of the content of the mind, the careful observance of what the consciousness is intended to and what content should be revealed. In this way, neither excludes ontological claims on the nature of the experience, nor strives to question the validity of such ontological claims that actually constitutes the structure of the very experience. And indeed, the inactivists say that the Cartesian anxiety, the mode of thinking that strives rather to question metaphysical claims about the objective reality than just to divide reality into spiritual and bodily realms, is now problematic, if not outdated. And the Husserlian correlational structure of potentiality seems to them to fit in with ground theories concerning relations between the mind and the world, and interpreting the constitutive processes discovered by Husserl as a claim that constitutional intentionality corresponds to a kind of self-organization. They see so the path to deepening the connection between phenomenology and an active approach in neutralizing but not denying natural attitude, as even Thompson once said. And thus, the conditions of the appropriateness of deployment of Husserlian phenomenology are somewhat missed. It is especially clear when one opens the later works of Husserl, where he discusses the problems of the genesis of transcendental subjectivity and general problems of the phenomenological method. And there, the methodological insights of Husserl and his transcendentalist position become inseparable. It turns out that, unlike the Buddhist samatha epoche, and phenomenological reduction are intended not to the clarification, but to the criticism of consciousness. And the vigor of universal grounding in Husserl is upon what the whole distinction of the transcendental and, according to Husserl, yet to be discovered, purely in a psychological description is built. For even the latter, seemingly more primitive, type of descriptive inquiry should not, according to Husserl in the Cartesian Meditations, misinterpret conscious life as a mixture of external and internal sensuousness. And thus, the idea of Husserl's phenomenology as of the science of essence does not concern the division of reality into something real or illusionary, but that of radical questioning. If within my field of transcendental phenomena, I no longer have theoretical validity as a human ego, as Husserl put it, the ideas too, it is obvious that the results of Epache, that is, in a field of spatial perception and kinesthesis, cannot be interpreted as an account of what means to exercise one's skillful mastery of the ways sensory stimulation varies as a result of bodily movement. For no data of the phenomenological reduction can be directly transmitted into the problematics of neurophysiology. Once the problem of Leib, the living body, remains intact or is tacitly assumed to be previously resolved by essentially non-phenomenological means. And this is just because the problematics of Leib for Husserl have their own specificity, distinct from the general results of the investigation of sense of the objects. In respect of this transcendental vigor, even the anxiety of Descartes was considered by Husserl in a certain sense superficial. And indeed, in the crisis of the European sciences, Husserl sees the very mind-body problem and the concept of soul as such as only the residuum of the natural attitude that still cannot occur unexamined, but in the naive psychological or natural study. And well, for an activist, it is a problem of specific dialogical and cultural environments that seems the culminating point of phenomenological research. For Eugen Fink, one of the most loyal disciples of Husserl, there are more fundamental questions, like the universal structure of the universe of monads, the mediation of the author in the phenomenal world, where phenomenology really culminates. But nevertheless, Fink recognized, without further clarification, that the various phases of Buddhistic self-discipline were essentially phases of phenomenological reduction. So the question of the relation between Husserl and Buddhism is hardly to be resolved now. But it seems like we should more attentively add together various methods in our methodology of cognitive research, be that in activism or whatever else, so that we obtain something clearly consistent and justified with respect to the parts of our methodological mixture. So, thank you much for the attention. That was actually the end of my presentation.
Thank you so much, Gillian, for this amazing presentation. So interesting subject. Does we have any question in the public? You can also write your questions in the chat if you prefer, or you can just ask by activating your microphone. Maybe Rafael, you have a question?
Not really. More like curiosity, perhaps. So can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Yeah, I mean, what was your motivation for trying to relate Husserlian phenomenology and Buddhism? Yeah, that would be my. It's more curiosity, to be honest.
Actually, this started when I started to read the active researches of Thomson, Varela, and Roche, and this started when I tried to examine what was their attitude to the transcendental position of Husserl and how they can deal with our Husserl, with how Husserl applied his methods in regard of the question of the transcendental subjectivity and regard of the question of foundation of sciences. For it is evident that the methodology of Husserl is not intended to clarify the consciousness like a container of mental events as distinct from the objective reality, but his methods are deployed so as to question the very origins of the certainty, the very origins of knowledge, while the inactivists already see, as every science should see, the objective reality, and they do not question like the very foundations of knowledge, and they even see it futile to question the fundamental notions of science, so to say. But as they use both Husserlian and Buddhist methodology, it was interesting to carry out such a study so as to check out how the deployment of one method can prove the validity or futility of the deployment of the other method. Yeah. Did I answer your question? Thanks.
Thank you so much for this discussion. We have another question of Francisco.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, perfectly.
Yes, I can.
Hi, Francisco.
Hi, thanks a lot for this activity, and thanks a lot for this conference and the previous one, Rafael, too. I'm going to do a very quick question because of my English too, and it's about intersubjectivity. Okay, and of course, the Buddhism has this relationship with compassion. I don't know if maybe I'm wrong, but I'm thinking also about the writings about the origin of Buddhism, right? The story of Buddha and the discovery of the dead, or the elder, you know, all this story. And if you find any in your investigation, in your research, have you find any way to compare, as you are doing it in this inactive perspective, with intersubjectivity in phenomenology? Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much. Well, I think if we regard the Buddhist compassion, then it is much more like this theme of Levinas rather than a theme of Husserl. For I think the problem of intersubjectivity in Husserl is not a problem of the attitude to the other as of something ethical, but this is a problem of how the other constitutes the world and how it is constituted from the perspective of the world as it constituted within us. No, actually, I did not specifically. I was never specifically concerned with the relations between Husserl and Buddhist notions of intersubjectivity, but from what you have said, I don't think that the Buddhist account of compassion could be clearly match the Husserl account, and it is really more a Levinasian story, I think.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We have another question from Alexandra.
Thank you so much, Ilya Onegi, for this courage of comparing them. I just have a question. Do you think there are some similarities and differences? And what kind of similarities and differences do you see between epoche, between phenomenological reduction and the most deep one, let's say, epoche, and the meditation as instruments of knowledge? So comparing epoche with meditation.
Thank you for the question. I think that in purely methodological terms, we can really deploy the techniques of meditation as somewhat like the infrastructure of epoche. But the problem is, however, how we problematize the data of what meditation gave to us. For, as I have already said, the epoche gave us not the account of something purely mental or something substantially mental, but it gives us an account of what things are by themselves. And this is quite divergent from the many version of what Buddhist meditation could strive for. But nevertheless, we actually can incorporate some meditation techniques into the practical implementation of epoche, but I think it is still problematic in a more global plan. So.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for this passionate discussion. And I let Rafael present our keynote speaker.
Yeah. Thank you, Luz. Thank you, for the presentation. And now we are going to end our today's session by listening to Saneke de Han. Thank you so much for accepting our invitation. Saneke de Han is Socrates Professor of Psychiatry and Philosophy at Erasmus University, Rotterdam. She also works as a senior researcher at the Department of Cultural Studies at Tilburg University and is a recipient of the Benny Grant of the Dutch Research Council. She's currently conducting a research project on self-illness ambiguity in patients with recurrent repression and on relational authenticity in psychiatry. She has been postdoctoral fellow at the Berlin School of Mind and Brain, Humboldt University, researcher at the University of Amsterdam, and Marie Curie Fellow of the EU Research Training Network Discourse at the University of Heidelberg. In 2020, her book Inactive Psychiatry was published by Cambridge University Press. Saneke, I give you the words.
Thank you, Rafael, for your kind introduction and for the invitation. And sorry, I had to miss your talk. It was timing-wise, I couldn't join earlier, so apologies for that, for turning in late. Sorry to have missed it. I'll see if I can share my screen. That should work. Does it indeed work?
Yes.
It should work. Yes. Now I can also still see you. Thank you. Yes, so I will talk today about the topic of my book, Inactive Psychiatry. But first I wanted to say something since this series is phenomenological transfers, I wanted to say a little bit of my own phenomenological transfer, so to say. My background is in phenomenology, and only when I was working in Heidelberg, and I met Hanne de Jager there, and Ezequiel Di Paolo, and Thomas Fuchs, obviously, I was introduced to an activism. And I'm now presenting this as sort of like a clear picture, as if like we have phenomenology here and activism there, but this, it's always easier in hindsight to sort of clearly delineate like, oh, this happened and that happened. So I could say that coming from phenomenology and working in psychiatry, I felt phenomenological psychopathology was really valuable in giving a really in-depth, rich descriptions of, the life world and experiences of psychiatric patients. So being depressed, and I think Thomas Fuchs, but there's many others too, again, are really good examples of that. So they can really give descriptions of in-depth description of what the experiences are like, what the life world is like in specific conditions. Yet at the same time, I was getting a bit, how do you say, unsatisfied in a sense, or I was missing things in phenomenology. And these things had especially to do with the role of the body, not just as a felt body or the body as the zero starting point of experiences, but also really the material body, physiological processes. Also because being at the psychiatry department, there is many research, neurocognitive research basically, and on physiological processes, neuronal processes, and genetic research and so on. And I had difficulty of combining, so to say, that type of research with the rich phenomenological descriptions or investigations. And also, I felt this developed actually more later in coming more and more into connection with feminist theories. There's lots of critique from this feminist perspective on that the embodiment of phenomenology wouldn't be specific enough, that it wouldn't be situated enough, that it doesn't do justice enough to that it matters whether you are male, female, Iris Marion Young, for instance, has written this really great paper, shifting paper, I think, in terms of for the phenomenology of throwing like a girl, but also Frans Fanon, the color of your skin, and the whole notion of intersectionality within feminism, that sort of the situatedness of our bodily being, how we are embodied and situated. And then, so meeting an activism by reading first the book by Evan Thompson, Mind in Life, and later on also The Embodied Mind, really felt a bit like sort of philosophical homecoming, because it felt to me like it provided, it sort of added to phenomenology this situatedness. It added a framework for thinking about the materiality of the body, the physiological processes that they are relevant and part of it. However, an activism, at least during that time, I think certainly was very much or seemed to focus, I should say, more on really basic cognition. And there was then, at that time, there was also this discussion that I think it was Azava, I'm not sure if that was him actually, who talked about this cognitive gap. They say, okay, an activist, you can have the sort of the basic stuff, the basic mind and so on. You can all go fully embedded there. But when it comes to higher cognition and activism, fails, and we should still adopt a representationalist approach. And I did feel that don't at all think we should go representationalist or anything like that. But I did feel that there was not so much attention within an activism for what I will later call this existential dimension. Right, so this is a bit of the background that they're walking around there as a philosopher doing research at the psychiatry department, following all these talks about, well, basically neurocognitive research on the one hand, and being embedded in the psychiatric practice on the other hand. I felt that my own sort of my own wish to how do you say, embed phenomenology or connect phenomenology was very much something that was also relevant for psychiatry as a practice, so to say. So this is what I termed the integration problem of psychiatry. So if you think about psychiatric disorders, all kinds of heterogeneous factors could possibly play a role. And these range from genetic, neurobiological on the one hand, to social and existential on the other hand. What I was intrigued by, I was thinking, how can we think of those? How can we think of how these relate, how they go together? And I think this question is really relevant because how you answer it also determines what you see as fundamental, what you see as the nature of psychiatric disorders. Now, in a recent paper by Richter and Dixon, they identified 34 models of mental health problems. So a lot of models about psychiatric, what psychiatric diseases are. And what they did is they grouped them. Well, you have the models focusing more on biology, more on psychology, more social models, consumer models, cultural models. And then you have several models who try to combine. Some combine 2 aspects, some combine 3 aspects, and in these different ranges. Now you can say this is, it's quite a hubris to want to add yet another model to those 34 models, yet I do feel that there is a place for this annective perspective, in particular because I think that that there are so far not these models that aim to be integrative don't really work so well. And I think annectivism can help to provide a sort of theoretical foundation for those integrative models, notably also the biopsychosocial model. What I proposed in my book was to group these heterogeneous factors together in 4 main dimensions. So these are big categories, so to say, so overarching categories. So you have to start with the experiences of the person, their physiological processes, again ranging from genetics, neurobiology, to gut, to whatever you can think of, and hormonal, and sociocultural. Another huge element having to do with the life world, basically, of the patient, and finally the existential dimension. And the existential dimension, with that, I refer to the fact that people do not just experience things, but relate to their experiences. And I felt this was important to recognize as a sort of separate dimension, because I think it's really important in when it comes to the development and persistence of psychiatric disorders. So this how you relate to what happens to you can play a major role in psychiatric disorders. So in roughly 3 ways. So it can play a constitutive role, and think here, for instance, of when someone has an anxiety disorder or has panic attacks and fears the fear, then they might suffer actually more of this fear of the fear than those panic attacks themselves. So it's a really a part of the problem, so to say. then it can play a modulatory role. So if many people are ashamed by what they experience, so if you have symptoms of obsessive compulsive disorder, for instance, you can be really ashamed of what you do and feel that it's crazy what you do, all the counting or all the checking or whatever. And this prevents people from seeking help. Obviously, stigma plays a role here as well. And also one's existential stance, so one's own reflection, so to say, on one's experiences may be affected by the disorder, as in the case of depression, for instance, where the depression itself determines your outlook on things, including your reflection. So, so you could say that following this overview of Dixon and colleagues, you could say, okay, this enactive psychiatry is sort of biopsychosocial model. I have reasons not to use bio and psycho and so on, but that's sort of, but it's roughly the same biopsychosocial model plus the existential dimension. And really important, it should be coherent, should be really integrated rather than just saying they're all important, but not saying how they relate. And this is what I will talk about in this talk today. So I will say a bit more about the existential dimension in a minute, and then give an example of how to understand this coherence. Yes, I'm not sure, it's difficult to estimate, so to say, whether I'm now, how do you say, offending you by giving an introduction of an activism, given that the previous speaker already sort of really in-depth discussed some major concepts. I'll just go ahead, and sorry for if this is all familiar to you. So what makes an activism such a good candidate, I think, for looking at psychiatric disorders and for solving this integration problem, is that it already starts from a really integrative view on that mind, body, and world are intimately related. And this specifically comes together in their notion of sense making. So as Varela, Thompson, and Roche define it, the mind is embodied and embedded. And they say this sense making and perception, action, and sense making are intertwined. But I won't say much about that. But I want to focus on this notion of sense making because that's, I think, the most relevant for psychiatric disorders. So you could say this sense making is the evaluative interaction of an organism with its environment. And as an activists argue, this sense making is essential to staying alive, the life-mind continuity thesis. It is, like I already said, embodied and embedded. It implies metabolic values. This is to say that as soon as you, as an organism that depends on interaction with the environment for its survival, that means that your perception of the world is not like a neutral collection of objects, but it will already be an environment in which things stand out as important for you or relevant for the organism. And this is especially work that Jonas has done already in the 1960s. And importantly, you can't get it, it's very much affective. This is what Giovanna Colombetti has also stressed. So you can't separate cognition and affect in this way, because sense making itself is affective. It is a bodily affective experience, so to say. But to that, I wanted to add that sense making can also be reflexive, so can also relate to itself, so to say, relate to itself, can relate to the experiences you have. And this is a crude picture to summarize this. So for any living organism, its environment is, it makes sense of its environment in terms of what is dangerous, what is food, what is relevant for it. But as soon as you have this capacity to take a stance on what happens to you, things change. I think you can actually say this is a different form of life. So you don't just have an environment in which you try to survive. You rather are a person living in a social-cultural world in which you try to live a good life, in which you try to be a certain person, a person in the world. I always use this picture because I think it really nicely sums up this difference that I just sketched in this crude picture. So as soon as you can take a step back, so to say, you're what I call, you live a different form of life. And this picture just shows like, oh, the dog is in the here and now, and the human is just thinking about all these other stuff as well. So a lot changes with this existential dimension. Since I make this distinction of this existential dimension, I do think it's important to point out that, so I make this distinction, there's this what I would call basic sense making, it's direct, it's immersed in the present environment. And on the other hand, you have this capacity for deliberate reflection. But not all of our sense making, obviously, is deliberate reflection. Yet the fact that we can do that, I think, changes everything. So it also changes our immediate sense making, and that's what I call existentialized sense making. So it refers to that our general sense making, our immediate and unreflective sense making, is not the same as the basic sense making, but is already transformed by the fact that we can take a stance on things. Right. I can actually see the time here. Yes, okay. Right. If you have this, following this picture of sense making, I think you can see psychiatric disorders as structurally disordered patterns of sense making, in which the unit of analysis is not an individual person, let alone an individual brain, but rather a person in interaction with her world. And when is this sense-making disordered? This sense-making is disordered when it is overly biased in a certain direction, you could say. So it's not properly attuned to the situation, it lacks flexibility. Regardless of the situation you're in, you are anxious. Regardless of the situation you are in, things appear as meaningless to you. Regardless of the situation you're in, everything appears super meaningful to you, as in case of some psychotic disorders. So the thing is that normally our sense making is attuned to the situation at hand, but in psychiatric disorders it gets so to say stuck in a certain direction. So you always have this a certain interaction pattern that's irrespective of the environment you're in. Okay, that's what I just said. Now, if coming back to this integration problem of how to integrate these 4 dimensions, sense making entails all these 4 dimensions, and sense making problems also entail all these 4 dimensions. My claim would be that you can't understand either of these 4 dimensions in isolation from the other 3. So if you change something, if something fundamental changes in one of these dimensions, it has an impact in all 3. Yeah, there's more to say about that, but in view of time, I'm already taking up quite some time, so I would like to move on. So it's one thing to say, well, they're all connected and it's all important, and they are, yes, and we should look at all of them. But then an important question is how to understand this causality, how to understand when you change something in someone's existential stance, what happens in their physiology and vice versa, or when you change something in someone's environment or sociocultural world, how this affects their existential stance or physiology, how to think of that. Here I will pick just one example, because there's just too much to discuss. But I think one that helps to see sort of the general move to that an active perspective offers here. So first of all, this grouping of these 4 dimensions, this picture is of course super simplistic. So when you think of each of these dimensions having many factors of their own, implicating each other, affecting each other, and so on, it's going to be very complex very soon. And this is a network model, so this is even a static picture. But if you put it over time, you get very complex systems that you're looking at. Yet I think we shouldn't be scared away by that, and should look at what are the basic moves that an active perspective encourages us to make. And then I think one of the main thing is that when you look at complex systems, we should move away from thinking in terms of a linear causality to an organizational causality. It's also in terms systems causality, or a non-linear, obviously, causality. To explain what I mean by that, I would like to look at the example of the relation between brain processes and experiences. So suppose someone has anxiety problems and they either take an SSRI, drugs, or they talk to a psychotherapist. And then the question is how to understand what's happening in these cases, how to understand the causality of what is affecting what, how the dimensions relate. And I think a sort of implicit, intuitive idea might be that when you take drugs, somehow you affect your processes in your brain, and this somehow affects your psychological or experiential processes. And the other way around, when you do psychotherapy, you target someone's psychological processes, and this somehow affects your neural processes. Now, the first thing to note, or to summarize, from an active perspective, this is first of all relating the wrong things, and secondly, it's relating them in the wrong way. So to start with the first thing, say it's the wrong things to try to relate. From this an active perspective, both physiological and experiential processes are part of this larger person-world system. They stand in a mereological relation of this bigger system. And that means that both of them should be understood in this larger context. So when you look at the effect of drugs, you should actually look at the effect of taking drugs. So this is not something that happens in a vacuum, obviously, unless someone would be drugged without them knowing that. But typically it takes place in a treatment relationship. People may have previous experiences with drug treatment. Their environment may have certain attitudes towards drugs and so on. This may all affect the effects of the drug. And similarly, when you are in psychotherapy, you are there as a complete bodily person, and the effect it has is not just on your psychological processes, so to say. No, rather when for instance, in a therapy session, your anxiety reduces, you're less anxious. This includes certain physiological processes like muscles relaxing, stress hormones going down, etc. So from this phenomenological perspective, it's important to see that you can't directly, so to say, relate neuronal and experiential processes. It's like putting two different magnitudes into one equation. You first need to convert them to a common denominator, namely the person in their world. But that's one thing. Yet you do want to do justice to the fact that there are differences between the causal trajectory of pill taking versus psychotherapy. So you do want to do justice to these differences as well. And here I think this is the second part. First, we need to, so to say, zoom out and see both of them in this bigger perspective. And second, we should see the interaction between the dimensions as cake-like and not domino-like. So rather than thinking there is either this neuronal process somehow affecting the experiential process, or the other way around, the experiential process somehow affecting the neuronal process, we should rather think of baking a cake, completely armchair philosophy knowledge I have of cake baking, watching lots of episodes from the Great British Bake Off rather than being an enormous baker myself. But I've learned a lot from watching television. And the fascinating thing is that well, it's very much chemistry, obviously. So when you add certain ingredients, their properties depend on their combination. So yeast reacts to sugar, but also the amount. So if you have your dough, if you mix everything together, the amount of kneading that you do will determine the structure of your dough, and this will eventually determine the taste of your cake. And obviously, each of these ingredients. I shouldn't get carried away with talking about cakes. But the important thing here is that when you change something in one of the ingredients, changing something in one of these ingredients is changing the cake, so to say. So if you add a bit of sugar, a tiny bit of sugar, you won't notice at the sort of global level of the taste of a cake. But if you add a lot of extra sugar, you will notice. I think this idea of you have, on the one hand, sort of local ingredients, but that work together in this organizational causality way, and they work together not in a sort of domino fashion way, but rather by being part of the cake, they determine the taste of the cake as a whole. So there's no domino causality between the amount of sugar and the taste of the cake. No, it's rather that because it's an element of it, changing the element implies changing the whole. So there's a lot to say about the notion of emergence in this respect, but I'll skip all of that here. And I think, so thinking in terms of this cake, I think can help us understand the kind of causality that's going on in either taking medication or doing psychotherapy. So if you take drugs, or if you in some sense influence in this case, your serotonin levels in your brain. This is what I would call a local to global causality. So it's like the amount of sugar affecting the taste of the cake as a whole. You have a certain threshold. A tiny change in your serotonin levels won't noticeably change your experiences. However, a bigger change in your serotonin levels will change your experience. So to say, the local effect impacts the global experience. And the other way around, so if we think of psychotherapy, we can see it as a global to local kind of causality. So you talking with someone in psychotherapy affects you as a person. This includes affecting your physiological processes, including your neuronal processes. So for instance, think here of the temperature of the oven, on the texture of the cake. Again, and not all local processes are equally affected by this. So some elements may be more affected than others. So your icing may be burned before the cake is baked. And in both cases, it's I think the crucial thing is to resist the tendency or the inclination to think in this domino causality kind of way, and rather think in this mereological or organizational causality kind of way. Right. So there is interaction between dimensions, but we shouldn't see that as there being sort of different causal systems affecting each other. No, rather we should see them as elements of a larger system, as excerpts of this larger system. And we shouldn't think of their causality between them as in a linear way, but in an organizational way. It does matter how you intervene in a complex system. You do have differences depending on how you intervene in the system. And you can distinguish between more local to more global and more global to more local effects. But the important thing is that it does make a difference how you intervene. And you can carve that out in these network models. So this is again to summarize sort of the shift in the picture. Right. This is my final 2 slides. I wanted to end with some implications for treatment. So one of the things that is often said, well, if you have such a complex system, how do you know where to intervene? I will say a bit more about that later, but first of all, it's important to note that from this complex dynamical systems, you shouldn't be, I don't think it's necessary to be, how do you say, discouraged by its complexity, because complex systems also means that there are many different ways to intervene. There's many different aangrijpunten, entrances, so to say, for interventions. And it has some important effects, thinking in this way that the effects of treatment may be non-linear too. So combining certain treatments may be more beneficial than you would think. And also thinking in terms of causality. So what is a cause of a specific psychiatric disorder should always be seen in the context of this person, in their environment and their history. So there's no, you can't just have a one size fits all kind of story here. Yes, so this is another point that I just mentioned, right? It encourages to use a broad spectrum of intervention, and that thinking in this complex system kind of way also means that the kind of factors that keep you or that may cause the problem may not be the same as the ones that keep you in your problems. So one way to make this more manageable is to use personalized network models. So to look per patient, what kind of specific elements in each of these 4 dimensions, and try to work out their specific relationships. So what affects what, and what are a person's strengths, what helps them, what is beneficial for them, and on the other hand, what doesn't work. And in this respect, I can highly recommend the work from Jonathan Lett-Larsen. I don't think it's yet published, but I would have to check. No, I think I would know, but he did very interesting research with patients with psychotic disorders who also were cannabis users, and he followed them. He had several interviews with them over the course of 2 years, And he made, on the basis of the first interview, he made this personalized network model to sort of sketch what affects their cannabis use and what affect their psychotic disorders. And he would discuss this with them in a second interview, so they could remark on the kind of model that he developed and say, oh, but this is important to add, or this is not the right arrow, and so on. And it really, I think it really nicely, it really helps to get an overview, but it also even have a sort of a therapeutic effect for the person themselves to see it in this certain way. And by taking this approach, he also found some really surprising things, or things that you don't immediately think of when you think of I want to treat someone with psychiatric problems, with psychotic disorders. But one of the things, for instance, in one of the patients that he interviewed, was that cannabis, at least as it is in Copenhagen, you can, when you buy it in bulk, it's cheaper. So this person would buy big amounts of cannabis because it was cheaper, and that would just be sitting there in a jar on the kitchen table. And just to have it so in front of your nose the whole day was something that played an enormous role. He also, for another person, he showed how starting education and having some role models there had a huge impact of how she could see herself on this really existential level, how she could imagine herself living a different life, and how that had a huge impact of the sort of the motivations she had, and the trust she felt that she could change things. And so there, I think it's really wonderful research that he did. So thank you for your attention. Yes, I'm happy to hear your questions if there are any.
Thank you so much for your really interesting talk. I assume there's going to be many questions. Maybe for those who would like to ask, please raise your hands. And so wait a little bit, maybe.
I see a hand by Francisco.
Oh, I did not. I'm a terrible
moderator. Am I seeing it wrong? No, that is right.
I think you're seeing it right, better than me for sure. Francisco, please.
Thank you. Thanks a lot for the presentation. I had a question related to phenomenology, to the method of phenomenology, right? Where would you put the analysis of living the whole structure of the 4 dimensions, right? Because I see there's a, like, as you say, a system, let's say. But I was asking myself about that existential part you were saying, the subjectivity that lives that existential part, and how subjectivity experience the whole inactive situation. Yeah. That was, I think that's my question for now. Thank you. Thanks again.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for your question. And do help me out if I don't understand you correctly. So you mean, so where is, so to say, do people experience this inactive system, so to say? Is that kind of sort
yes, of exactly, because I'm thinking about also yes, exactly, how those people experience this. And I was thinking, I think it was Professor Rizzo who talked about Nathalie Debra before, and I was thinking about the cardiofenomenology, because the heart, as I understand what she exposes, the heart has a big and active and phenomenological point in this whole. So I was going also to ask about this part. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Yes. Yeah, so there is a sort of, so when I make this clumsy kind of like sketch with these 4 dimensions and so on, and the arrows, and you have this person and you have this world and this relationship, it is very much this third person description of what happens for a person interacting in their world. So in that sense, yeah. So that's but that has to do with, so to say, the level at which, I should say, with the specific question that I ask myself. So how do these factors relate, and how to sort of see that? But if you then go back to the person experiencing things, I think you can actually use those 4 dimensions very, very much so as well. And there, I should say, then the distinction between experiences and existential doesn't hold, in the sense that it is a type of existential is a type of it, or is a form, or is a structure of our experiences, I should say. So that is really sort of for heuristic purposes that I took apart these as different dimensions. Yeah, but but if you then go back to the experiencing person, I mean, I think that the descriptions of phenomenological psychopathologists, they are about this. They are about how do people experience their world? How do they experience themselves? And one remark that I, in that respect, really liked was by a phenomenological psychopathologist, a Dutch one, Van den Berg, who said, if you ask the patient to describe their world to you, you will understand what their problem is. They will describe themselves, basically. And he said, similarly, if they would describe how their experience of their body, the experience of time, the experience of other people, he says, he quotes Ludwig Binswanger, who said that no matter where you lift the carpet, in which corner, so to say, you start to lift the carpet, it will reveal the same kind of picture, because it is this person in their life. It's how you experience the world is not something that stands apart from you. It's your sense making it's what sense you make of it. Does that address your question, or is that?
Yes, very interesting. Yes, thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Now we have Andrea Pace Janota. Andrea, are you there?
Yes. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes.
The audio was shut. So thank you. It was very interesting. Yeah, my question maybe, so feel free to not answer to it, or like it's just something that goes in another direction maybe, but it was a curiosity, and it's also linked to the previous talk about Buddhism and meditation. So I was wondering what's your idea, because I was thinking about that, the fact that for me it sounds very natural to think about an application of the enactive approach to psychiatry and psychology, because I looking at Varela, Thompson, Roche, the embodied mind. There is a reference to meditation, to mindfulness awareness meditation as a way of freeing from existential suffering and so on. So
Yes.
However, I was wondering what's your idea about it in the context of the application of really in psychotherapy, even this idea of the attachment to the idea of the self as something permanent, substantial, considered as the source of also mental suffering that is at the heart of this practice. But because it comes to my mind as possible problems also in this approach, like I know that there is a problem of nihilism in the Buddhist tradition, because if I detach myself from this, so what I do, so it can be a source of depression.
Yeah.
So I was just thinking, what's your idea about this?
Yes, thanks very much. Yes, thanks very much. Nice question. Yes. So two things at least. Yeah. So mindfulness training. A PhD of mine is actually doing research in mindfulness training. And Thompson did a lot of work. I mean, many people did work in this, and I think it makes total sense to and this is what I would call this existential dimension, that your stance towards what happens to you is so important for the kind of meaning that you attach to it, or the kind of is so important for the role it can play, or the amount of suffering it causes you, right? So that I think it makes total sense that if you learn not to take certain cognitions, to call it this way, sort of thoughts too seriously, that will already be for many people a huge relief, or some feelings, and for instance, also people with obsessive compulsive disorder, but also people with depression. And this is also what the previous question about the apple cave, right? About the previous sort of like, if you can sort of bracket this and sort of can think, okay, I experienced this, but I don't have to sort of see this as determining who I am. I don't have to act on it. I can bracket this, or I can make sense of it as this is a thought coming from my anorexia, my depression. This is something that this is something that I don't have to follow. This is an inclination, something like that. Yeah, I think mindfulness can be a super powerful way, and there's many other, of course, psychotherapies that target this existential stance, but I think mindfulness can be a very powerful way to do that too. Also because it's so focused on your experiences, and also because it's so, when you are practiced in that way, it's really helpful that if you manage to sort of take your breathing and in the moment, so to say, be able to use that technique to not be overwhelmed by whatever you experience. Super useful. The second point, so the view of the self, the Buddhist view of the self. Yes, well, this is I find it hard, so to say. I'm going to give a personal answer, because I can't separate me as a philosopher from me as a person in this respect. So I personally made a journey from Buddhism to humanism, especially on this point of the how do you say, the dogma sounds so, no, the thesis, so to say, that the world is suffering and so on, and that any attachment is increases the suffering and so on. I increasingly felt that I couldn't share this view, and that I felt like that caring about the world and caring about others is like really valuable and important, and that I missed the solidarity also in Buddhism, that I felt it was too much focused on sort of individual, on individual freaks. Of course, there's all the bodhisattva. There's, I don't want to sort of claim as if I know so much about Buddhism, but an important part for me, the shift from Buddhism to humanism, was that I felt like, no, I don't want to sort of, I think caring is good. I think caring about things is a good thing, and that means suffering, but it's sort of, you can't have one thing without the other, and here I feel that in psychotherapy, I sometimes feel that that the view of the getting detached from the self, so to say, that it's almost a coping, a bit like Stoicism, right? It's a sort of coping strategy in which you look at everything with this indifferent. You're not touched by it, and then you remain this calm and so on. Yeah, no, I'm personally, yeah, it doesn't fit my world and human view, so to say. Yeah, so for me, it feels like then you are just, this is what living is, and this is what living makes beautiful and horrible all at the same time. But yeah, and what it has to do with an activism, it probably just means that I think differently than Varela, Thompson, and Roche. But I think there's room within sort of, there's all these kinds of, how do you say, different strands of an activism. And I wouldn't go with this too strict Buddhist kind of view. I would go for a more humanist, caring. Caring is good kind of strand.
Yeah, my knowledge is limited too, but I would say also that in Buddhism, these are problems, I think, from what I know, and there are also strands that are focused on compassion, on caring for the others. So they have this humanistic aspect, and not the idea of the hermit, like somebody would detach.
Yes, yes.
So this is maybe just one possible direction. So.
Yeah, in which they can be reconciled, maybe. Yeah, thanks. Yeah.
Thank you.
We have another question from Rodrigo.
Thank
Rodrigo.
you. Yeah. Do you hear me? Yeah, right?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you, Seneca, for, well, such a complete presentation. I would love to zoom in all the details of the model that you showed us. I guess I also have a sort of, I don't know, parallel or broad question. I was wondering if the model is reduced to individual disorders, and as opposed to social disorders or social pathologies. And I'm guessing the answer is, of course, not. But then I like focus my question then in how can we, with this model, either, I don't know if it's the organizational structure or simply the inactive model in general, how can we deal with for example, problems such as social pathologies and assume a more collective stance than individual?
Yeah, very important question. Yes, thank you. Yes, I've had many discussions about this during the writing of my PhD with one of my supervisors, Gerrit Glas, who said, yeah, but you're too much of a system thinker, because why then focus on the individual at all? And I would say then, I do think that focusing on the individual makes sense. I do think it's, I would say that indeed it's this person with this specific history in this specific environment that we are looking at. It's the person who has the suffering. It's the person who has the problems. Yet, very importantly, like you say, the person is shaped by what they've experienced. They are shaped by the cultural community that they are part of. And obviously, when there are certain social problems, for instance, well, this is at least a discussion in the Netherlands. I don't know how that is with you, but there's this huge pressure on young people to be excellent, to have this huge CV, to sort of, it's really oriented towards achievement. And what you see is that many young people already get burnouts. And then you can, and to sort of, then to acknowledge that and to see the political dimension also of that requires you to sort of zoom out and not just treat every individual burnout but really see like we are doing something in our society that's hurting people. That's just, and of course there's things like structural racism and discrimination and there's a huge, huge impact on psychiatric problems is poverty, social inequality. I mean, we can't just pretend like the individual's problem as if they are, they are individuals, but they are in as part of a society, and this society has a huge impact on them, and how people grow, and even on the very sort of personal level of the family, how people grow up. The people who struggle to make ends meet and have very serious economic problems or housing problems, children who grew up in these circumstances are much more likely to have mental problems later on. And it just, I mean, it makes total sense, right? So I'm glad that you mentioned this, because I think there's very much a political dimension also to this. And I think actually that for psychiatry, for psychiatrists, it's really difficult what to do with this dimension, right? So you have an individual that you're treating, an individual coming to you with their individual problems. Yet I think that psychiatrists should, on a sort of a parallel track, so to say, should also be politically active. Like there are things in our society that make us mentally ill, basically. Yeah.
Oh. So I don't know. I didn't see another raised hand, so I was wanting to use the opportunity also to ask you something. We're heading out of time, but maybe okay. So in systems theory, there is always this trade-off between the level of complexity your model have, and then there is this thing of the level of between complexity and I think accuracy, and accuracy comes also with the capacity of a model to predict and, to talk more generally, to control a system. So my question is, since you present this highly complex model, from your perspective as an inactivist, so how is this model able to let's say, produce certain regular outcome on patients' behavior?
Yeah. Yes. And here I think I should have watched your talk to have learned from you previously. This is a really difficult one, and I get this question a lot also from people who want to work with this, right? Sort of like, okay, so how do we work with this? So when I have this idea of this personalized network models, right, to sort of fill in these dimensions with someone's personally relevant aspects, the amount of sleep someone needs, or certain hormonal aspects, or and filling out social circumstances, blah, 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 filling this out. Personalized means tailor-made, but also means what use is it, so to say, for how can you use that for your next patient, so to say, because that's of course also what you want, right? You hope that when you do a certain diagnosis and then you say, oh, this is depression and so on. So I think there is a certain middle way. This is a bit of a boring answer maybe, but I think the way in which this works, that on the one hand you have all these very personal circumstances. It makes a huge difference how someone is embedded and what their strengths are and weaknesses and so on. Yet at the same time, the psychiatric disorder itself, so to say, is a rigid pattern. So in a sense, people who are all depressed, so to say, are a bit stereotypical in that way, or look alike in a certain way. So because they share a certain tendency to react in a certain way, making them much more alike than if they weren't depressed, then it would just be all these very different individuals. So the pattern is, so to say, what they have in common. Do you understand what I mean? Yes, I see you. So yeah, the pattern is what makes them alike. And so based on this pattern, you might say, okay, there are certain things that work for people with depression rather than for people with OCD. Yet, yet what you see is that there is very little specific treatment in psychiatry. So both in terms of medication, SSRIs, for instance, are used both by depression, anxiety disorder, psychotherapy. People can treat with psychotherapy many different conditions, and you could wonder whether it's so specific. And now I lost the thread of where I wanted to go. Oh yeah, predict and control, right? You wanted to say, can you make predictions on the basis of this? What this researcher Jonathan Ladd-Larsen that I showed this graphic from, he wants to try to do big data with qualitative data. He wants to see if you use rich data, rich qualitative data, and you use a lot of it, can't you sort of still quantify it then? Aren't there patterns after all? Yeah, and yeah, I think that there might be, but I think there will always be an idiosyncratic part to it as well. Because people are different, their histories are different, because for the one person, it really helps to just go and run and go and do sports to empty their heads. And for another person, it really works well to see their friends and talk with their friends. And for yet another person, so yeah, I think there will always be an idiosyncratic individual element as well. But I'm happy to hear also your thoughts on this. If you have.
Yeah, I mean, I might write you about this, but now I have to leave because I have to go to the airport. But Luz is going to take care of the moderation from now on. Thank you so much. I really enjoy your talk, and I am sorry I have to leave. Luz, please.
Thank you.
So
and
much.
I'm happy to hear any recommendations you have. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Sanneke, for this amazing talk. Do you have a minute for another question?
Yes, yeah, yes? I do, yeah.
Thank you so much. So, Alexandra,
Yes.
you can...
Thank you so much, Sanneke, for your wonderful presentation. Because it's about psychiatry and the psychiatric patient, I would like to ask you, how do you see the relation between phenomenology and psychoanalysis? So where would you place in this topology of your model? Where would you place the singularity of the symptom and of the suffering person?
Thank you. Yes, that's a huge question. I should make a disclaimer right away that psychoanalysis is also has so many variations and so many different applications that that I don't dare to say. I don't know enough about all these to say that. But as a coincidence, yesterday I talked with a psychoanalyst about this sort of enactive model, and she said it was really compatible with psychoanalysis. She also said, yes, psychoanalysis is this very embodied type of therapy. And I was actually surprised because I would never have classified it as embodied. Anyway, but so on a sort of very abstract level, I think you can say, I mean, psychoanalysis is very much a psychodynamic view, right? And I think that's really compatible with both phenomenology and enactivism. So it's very much focused on processes during time, and how things change and affect each other. The idea that when you, so the enactive idea of laying down a path in walking, I think that could very well fit with psychoanalysis as well. That, well, this whole idea of this specific interaction patterns and how you've developed them. And there's a different language around that, like you call them defenses, or yeah, I don't know enough of the of the specific psychoanalytical, but a language to do that. But yeah, I could see similarities there. But if you are more, yeah, I'm also curious to hear your view. If you happen to have more have a view on this yourself, I'm.
Thank you so much. I think we do not have the time now. Yes, or
yeah, it's a bit late already. Yeah.
Yes. Now, I was, thank you so much for your answer. I just wanted to bring in discussion the singularity of the symptom, which is sometimes difficult to be placed in a model in a certain place. It's, yeah. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for this interesting discussion. Thank you so much, Sanneke, for your presentation. It was amazing. Thank you also to Ilya and Rafael, that they are not there. We want to thank also to the Peruvian Circle of Phenomenology and Hermeneutics, the Center of Philosophical Studies, and the Direction of Technologies and Video Conference of the Pontifical Catholic University of Peru. Thank you, Mariana, Rosemary, and Vania for all your help. And we will meet each other on April the 2nd to listen to Zakaria Nemen, Julian Bass Kruger, Milagro Saldaña, and Andrea Pache Giannota. That is here.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, and thank you all for joining and for your good questions.
Thank you.
Thank
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.